All right. We are live now on Facebook. Thank you to everyone for joining us today for Siri Connect. I'm Ashley Gadiana, the Director of External Affairs at the Connecticut Institute for Refugee and Immigrants. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Leonella and Israeli, and I'm going to turn it over to both of you for quick introductions, starting with Leonella.
Hi, my name is Leonella Cruz-Alwalt, and I am the Director of Project Rescue. That is our anti-human trafficking program, as well as Unaccompanied Minors program.
And my name is Israeli Mendia-Tacuapio. I am the post-release home study case manager, and I work with unaccompanied minors.
Perfect. So as usual, these conversations are live on Facebook and will be uploaded to our YouTube page and our website, cirict.org, over the next 2 or so days. While we're doing this, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the comments box on Facebook, and we will see them, and then we'll answer them as we go. If we can't get to any questions you may have, again, type them in the comment box, and we'll get back to you after we are done with this. So today we're here to talk about unaccompanied immigrant children and the work that Siri is doing with these youth in Connecticut. So we'll start big picture, and then we'll go into the work we're doing, and then a little bit of a look forward. Will be no more than 30 minutes today. So if, Leonella, why don't you start, unless Israeli you prefer, but can you start by outlining exactly who or what an unaccompanied child is? How do we get to that definition?
Right. So unaccompanied children, these are children that are coming into the United States without a parent or legal guardian at the point that they're entering the United States. And these are children that have no lawful immigrant status in the United States, and they are under the age of 18. Many of these children, they can come from a number of places, right? But most of the children that we're seeing are primarily coming from Central America. The highest percentage would be from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And a higher percentage would be males coming in versus female. So these children are children without status. And again, as they come, as they're apprehended at the border, generally not with a parent or guardian on their own.
Okay, great. Israeli, did you have anything to add to that? Oh, a little bit of technical glitch. It seems to be the theme for the last few days. So anybody watching, bear with us. So for some context, some numbers for folks watching, between fiscal year 2015 and fiscal year 2018, it seems like there was an average of 44,000 unaccompanied children apprehended each year. That number spiked to 72,000 in fiscal year 2019. Obviously, COVID has impacted 2020, and we've seen a decrease, but certainly not by much. So it's not just a couple hundred children coming. It seems like there's tens of thousands of children coming to our borders.
Right, right.
So, looking at the process again, how does an unaccompanied child end up in the United States? Are they fleeing from violence? What's resulting in them being here and them being here alone? And, Israeli or Leonella, whoever would prefer to take that.
And I can start off. I think every case with these children, they're very unique. And every child has a reason to flee the country. And there's a number of circumstances that could affect why they have to leave their country. A lot of the cases that we've been working with, these children are fleeing violence, very difficult circumstances where they could be being recruited for gangs or to do things in their home country that they may not agree with. Many have witnessed horrendous crimes and end up fleeing. Many don't have parents, which is why they end up coming to the United States, and just the conditions that they're currently living in their home country, which is why many choose to leave their home country.
Okay. Is there really anything else there?
Well, usually, just to piggyback what Leonella said, usually it is because of that financial disparity. Some are looking to continue their studies, and unfortunately, because of the economic situations that happen in their home, they're not able to attend school due to safety or financial reasons.
Yeah, many of the children that we work with actually have to stop going to school because they have to provide for their family, or they're just not able to attend school because of the circumstances in their town where they may be living, just not enough resources for them to be able to continue their studies. So many end up stopping at a very young age, or if they go out on a very part-time basis. So many come to the United States seeking those opportunities that they're not offered in their home countries.
Of course. Real quick question. Laura asks, why more males than females?
I'm not quite sure if I have an answer to that. This is a number that we were looking at for FY 2020 and in general in the United States. It's not by a big difference, but there are more males coming in. I think in terms of just the family structure, oftentimes the males are the ones that provide. Many of the children that we've worked with come here seeking opportunities, looking for a way to be able to provide for either the parents or siblings back home. And generally, in Israeli, if you agree with me, but generally what we notice is it's generally an older male, maybe the oldest brother coming over to try and find educational resources or just a way to provide for others.
And then be able to provide that back across the border. Okay.
Correct.
So you mentioned that these are kids who are coming here on their own. Is that correct?
Yes.
They're not coming with parents and then being separated. They're really fleeing to the United States as, an individual child. Is that
right? And I think on the media, that's where things can get a little bit confusing, because there are families coming together. There are people seeking to reunify with others. So there's different types of cases. But the children that we are specifically talking about, these are children that have embarked on this journey on their own with no adult to assist. And when they arrive in the United States and they are apprehended, they are by themselves. Which
in and of itself is hard to fathom, right? As a mom or as a parent or somebody who knows or is around small children, young children, it's hard to imagine and taking that journey.
Exactly. And when you talk to some of these children, it's not, like any journey. It's like, this is a journey where they can take buses or walk for miles. And there's just a number of ways that they have to, in order to just be able to get to the border, oftentimes not even being successful, just because it's so dangerous and just difficult, expensive. So, we've had very young children and it just makes you wonder, how difficult that journey must be. Just even making the decision, it's time to leave my home country, the only place that I know, and go on this journey. And I don't even know if I'll make it.
And then I don't know anybody there.
Exactly.
Or maybe I know somebody there because they're a distant relative, but beyond that, I've never met them. It's pretty incredible, just the act of getting to the U.S., much less what happens once you're here.
Exactly.
So once an unaccompanied child ends up in the United States, what happens? Are they taken into custody and then released? Are they deported? What does that process look like once they've arrived at the border?
Okay, so generally the children, once they're apprehended by Customs, Border and Protection, and then
not Connecticut.
So generally it's Border Protection, and they have about 72 hours to turn them over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And then under the Office of Refugee Resettlement, it's pretty complex, but it's the Administration of Children and Families that also works with the Department of Health and Human Services.
So that was CPB. DH, Health and Human Services,
and the Administration of Children and Families. But essentially, if we want to make the process easier, we go from Customs, Border Protection, and they go over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and there we begin the services provided to unaccompanied children. Okay.
Is a child then automatically held up in our legal system as an individual who has come across the border illegally, or what is the involvement with the immigration legal system at that point?
So these children are put in proceedings, and whether they're able to identify a sponsor or somebody to help them, they are in the process. as soon as they, have come into a shelter and they are identified as an unaccompanied minor. So that's why it's very important that they identify an attorney or somebody that could assist them with the immigration process, because as we all know, it's a very complex process,
Right.
Especially when you are under the age of 18 and not quite sure how this process works. So, one of our jobs, which is really we'll talk more about, is being able to assist them in identifying providers that can assist with this process, especially if they have started in one state and, for example, moved to Connecticut, making sure that that immigration process is moved and follows them, and that they are in fact attending all of the court dates that they're expected to attend. And within that, trying to figure out if they are eligible for immigration relief, whatever that relief may look like. But it really is complex, and it's a process that's not stopped as they're trying to identify if there's a sponsor or trying to figure things out. It's something that continues. Obviously now with COVID, things have been slightly delayed, but that being said, it is the duty of that minor, and once they're reunited with the sponsor, to find somebody to assist with that immigration process.
Right, because just because they're a child doesn't mean that they have a right to counsel
exactly
through this process, right? Which is pretty unbelievable.
It's pretty crazy.
And I know there's lots of organizations who, are out there trying to help, but certainly the fact that youth are not guaranteed a right to counsel in immigration proceedings, no matter what age, right? Whether we're talking a 5-year-old or a 17-year-old, is astounding. And it's, complex and difficult for an adult, much less a child, to navigate immigration
It's pretty
law.
scary to see when you see, kids under the age of 5, I think at any age, right? Under the age of 18.
Right.
We have a client who is 4 years old.
How old is Riley?
4.
They
are
a 4-year-old. Okay.
And they have scheduled court dates as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask, there's a handful of things I wanted to unpack from what Leonella just said, but I was going to ask the age, right? We know a child has to be under 17 to, be Correct. Qualified as an unaccompanied child, but how young are we seeing?
We've seen as young as babies, when I'm talking about infants, right? Because we've had minors that have babies and then babies that have, one way or the other, and across the border. So we've seen all ages. I would say our biggest group is generally the teenagers. But that being said, what Israeli mentioned, we do get these younger ones. And that just it brings up a number of questions, because, if the sponsor doesn't really take on that responsibility, or they don't go to the, immigration court because they're nervous about their status, a number of things, you then wonder, so then what happens to this child if they don't identify somebody to assist with this process? So there's a number of things that come up as we're thinking about these cases.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump around a little bit here, because I want to get back to the idea of sponsor. I don't know that everybody understands what that looks like. And I also want to talk about risks once a child is here in the United States. Mm-hmm. So let's start with what it looks like when, again, once a child is here in the United States, what's a sponsor? Where are they ending up? Can you explain what that process looks like? How they might end up, for example, here in Connecticut or anywhere across the country?
Okay. And I can start that off, and then Israeli, if you have anything to add in, feel free. So generally, once they're under OR care, right? The Office of Refugee Resettlement, they're placed in one of the shelters that there are throughout the United States. Shelters, we don't identify the location, but we know that they are spread out throughout the U.S. And as soon as these children are placed in the shelter, they are given a phone call, and they begin that process to be able to try and identify a sponsor. And that sponsor could be a biological parent, it could be a relative, but it could also be a family friend. And that begins a longer process, right? How do we know that this is a safe placement for that minor? Is this sponsor going to in fact take care of this minor? Have they had previous sponsorships? There's a number of questions that we're asking throughout this process, just to ensure that the minor is placed in a setting where they will be taken care of throughout the entire process.
Okay. And when you talk about shelters, are those, again, what people see on the news, down at the border, or are those vastly different from, kind of the border detention center camps that are all over the news.
You know, shelters can look very different depending on what state they're in and how many, you know, children they're taking in. We have had the opportunity to visit a couple of shelters, and when we're looking at the ones that we visited, it's the children have access to services. So right while they're in the shelter going through this process, they are going to school, they are getting medical services, mental health services if needed. So they're getting the full support that they need while they're at the shelter, right? Some children may be at the shelter a lot longer than others, so services may look a little different. So it really does depend on the case. And is this minor the age? Are they coming with siblings? So shelters look very different, but the ones that we've worked with, right? It's not like what we're seeing at the border. It's more the children have their own bed, they have their own space where they're able to stay while we're going through the process of identifying that sponsor.
Okay. Israeli, did you have anything to add at this point? I know we'll get really into what we do here, but anything on that?
So it also differentiates between what kind of services the child may need. There are children who require a little bit more one-on-one. So they are placed at a different shelter with different capacities. So it kind of depends on the level of kind of things that the shelter has identified that the child needs as well.
Okay. So they really do try and tailor and match the needs of a child with what a shelter has available or what services they're able to provide?
Yes. So
Okay.
depending on, for example, mental health needs, they need something more, what we would call residential. So they'll be placed more in a residential shelter. So
Okay.
depending on what they specifically need.
And for
Okay.
example, Ashley, there's some minors that also have babies, right?
Right.
So we would need a shelter that would help provide those services, not just for the minor, but the minor's baby as well. So it really depends on the type of case that we're looking at.
Okay, sounds good. And hey, Jay, I see your question. Curious about data of children in Connecticut shelters, if possible, what towns? We obviously, for the safety of everyone involved, don't disclose locations of shelters in Connecticut or around the country.
Yeah.
You know, we have to be very careful with that. So we'll leave it with that. But, you know, if you have other questions, feel free to put them in or email me as well.
And, you know, we can share, Israeli and I had a conversation yesterday, actually, in terms of numbers. And I think one of the things that we do want to clarify is that we are contracted to provide services to a certain number of children. And right now, that can average between 65 and 75. Is that the full scope of children that are entering the state of Connecticut? No. Children can enter the state of Connecticut without getting services like the ones that we provide here at Siri Project Rescue. Children can come in a number of ways. So in terms of numbers, when we share numbers, we're sharing specific to the clients that we are working with. That being said, the number could be much larger for Connecticut.
Right. And I think a good example of that is it may have just been last year where we heard a lot about unaccompanied youth in the Norwalk school system and Norwalk community, I guess, as a whole. We don't necessarily provide services to all those children, but they were unaccompanied youth in Connecticut.
Right.
So we're working on
we notice it. We notice it too, Ashley, when we're working with like our immigration program, where some of these children may actually come in to meet with our DOJ accredited reps, and they're not coming in through our unaccompanied minors program, but they are unaccompanied children still seeking services. So you can see them. They're obviously very present in the community, whether it's the school system, working with the social service providers throughout the state. But like I said, I wanted to make that clarification in terms of numbers, because when I refer to numbers, I'm referring to what Israeli as a case manager is actively working with for the year.
Okay, perfect. So one last question, and then we'll dive into the work that we do. You know, talk for a minute about the risks that unaccompanied children face, again, once they've arrived here. We know that they're facing extreme risks, and that is a large part of what drives them out of their country of origin. But, you know, what are the risks once they hit the border or, you know, begin this process of locating a sponsor, you know, being placed in foster care, whatever that looks like?
Israeli, do you want to?
So some of the risks, especially during the ages of 16, 17, specifically our youths that are what we call aging out.
Okay.
They run the risk of running through labor trafficking, just because there's sometimes this massive debt that they still are responsible for. So not all sponsors have the best intentions for the children. They promise them jobs, they promise them security, and end up trafficking them that way. The other risk that they run into is potentially not living with that original sponsor. There are many factors that can kind of change who they live with. For example, if the sponsor no longer wants to provide for them, or if there's another family member that might had promised that they were able to stay, but because of different reasons, they no longer reside with them. And also, a lot of the children do not have access to benefits as well, like, for example,
Okay.
medical care, dental, mental health resources.
Right. Okay. Leonella, anything to add there?
Yeah, no. So I think, we've had this conversation, and I think we will continue talking more about this, is that big risk of these children potentially being trafficked. And what's important to know is that many of these children have been trafficked in their home country en route to the United States, and then many run that risk of being trafficked, whether it's in their placement or once they've left their placement. They are at a very high risk because of the number of factors that Israeli already mentioned, not having access to the services that a U.S. born child would have, right? And being at that very high risk where they may not know people in their community, and they may, have to go out and find work in order to be able to survive. And that puts them at a very high risk of being trafficked. And people take advantage of these children because they don't have status, because they don't know how the laws work here in the United States. So there's a number of risks that these children run. So that's why we often focus on that. But then there's other things, right? Many of these children, even if they are provided with the resources, may not go see a doctor, may not go see a dentist, even if it's needed, just because of that constant fear that they may have. So that's why it's so important to keep them engaged as often as we can. Israeli mentioned those children that are aging out, and those are the ones that are turning 18. We're always very concerned about those cases, because once they turn 18, we can close the case. We have to close the case because they're no longer considered a child. And that's our concern, because oftentimes that's when the children tend to disappear, stop going to school, because there is not that need to continue checking in with their case manager or their provider.
Okay. So let's turn for the next, 10 minutes or so to what Siri does specifically. So a child comes into the country, likely apprehended, ends up kind of moving through ORR, all of these different offices. They get placed in a state. For the rest of our conversation, we're presuming that they're placed in Connecticut, either at a facility with a sponsor, in foster care. What do we do? How is Siri then involved?
So the way that we become involved is, so the shelter would identify certain safety risks for the children. It could be a physical disability, either been a victim of trauma or potential trafficking. So they will identify those risks, and then they will create 3 different referrals that we usually do. Either it will be a home study, which will be before the minor is released to the home. So part of our job here in Siri is that we conduct home studies, we conduct interviews with the minor, the sponsor, and any household members, just to identify what kind of relationship they have with the minor and with the sponsor. Before COVID, we were able to go into the home and evaluate the home environment, see if there are any more people living that they actually originally had reported. Any environmental concerns as far as were there rooms extra that the sponsor didn't mention, or was there any other trafficking concerns as far as having many minors under one home, and also different things like that. Now with COVID, we switched a little bit and become virtual. Unless there is a high concern, we do in person if there's a very big safety concern. So that usually we create a report, and then from there on, we send it to the shelter, and the shelter makes a decision whether or not the minor is going to be released to the sponsor. And then we also do, once that happens, the minor is released to the sponsor if it's approved.
Okay, so that's
And then
the
what
first.
about post-release services? If you could talk a bit more about that one.
So with post-release services, we have two different types. We have one that we just work with the minor for 90 days, ensure that the sponsor followed up with the requirements, which is enroll them in school, identify a legal provider, and connect them within the community. So part of my role is to ensure that the minor is living with the original sponsor, make sure that they're following up with medical care and enrolling them in school, and any other information that they are looking for in the community. So we're more of a support and a guide for them, because most of the minors have not lived here in the United States. So, and some of the sponsors have not identified those community resources that are out there. When we do a TVPRA, what we consider a TVPRA is for minors who we keep until either they turn 18 or they are granted status or they are served with an order of deportation. So we work along with them to also just follow them, see if there's anything they need, enrollment in school, and legal services as well.
Okay, and when you say you're the support system, are you saying you're the support system for the minor or for the sponsor, or both? Are you really working collaboratively with both of them?
So it'll be with both. With the sponsor, it'll be identifying what it is in their community, kind of talking about any other things that they may need, because also they're here. The sponsor can, for example, lack literacy. Some of them do not know how to read and write. So that's one barrier. So try to connect them within the community.
Okay, and what happens after 90 days? So that's obviously a very short amount of time, right? When you think about somebody newly arrived in the country, newly arrived in the state, newly arrived in a community, and trying to get those basic things set up. Sure, I can see how you could set up school enrollment, medical appointments, etc. But what happens after 90 days? Is it really just then we're done and nobody is monitoring or overseeing this? What does that look like?
So with that, we try to connect them. That's why community resources are very important. In some cases, when I identify some of the minors needing that extra support, I try to connect them to care coordination. So it's an ongoing service after my role is done. Also, we try to build those school relationships, because the school social worker can see if the children need anything else. So it's really embedding them in the community and seeing what other resources that the children qualify for as well, because they do not qualify for all services, but some services do not require any status or insurance.
Leonela, do you have anything to add there?
I think the only thing that I will add in is, as Israeli mentioned, we have the home study and the post-release services. That being said, not every child would be referred for a home study, although at times we wish that were the case, but it doesn't happen. When we're going into, not specifically Israeli, when she goes into these homes to assess, like, is this a sponsor that could take in this minor, she's looking at a number of risk factors, which she's already mentioned. But a lot of the cases that we're getting are children that are just released to the sponsor. So at this point, she's going into the home and trying to work with both the sponsor and the minor, along with family members. When we get a case referred, it's the minor, but you go into a home, you have a number of people that you're also working with and trying to get everyone engaged and ensuring that that sponsor is following through with everything that they agreed to say, that they agreed that they would do for the minor on behalf of the minor.
And why are some youth provided with home studies while some are not?
So, as Israeli mentioned, a lot of it is because of the concerns, the red flags that could be presented. So it's human trafficking. There could be a disability. There could be concerns about that minor being placed because maybe that sponsor has already taken in a number of children and has not followed through with services. There could be a risk of that minor physical, sexual abuse, or maybe that minor has had a history or experience physical and sexual abuse. Okay. And how will that sponsor, handle that? Will they be able to provide the mental health services that that minor needs? So I think, Israeli, is there anything else that you would add on to that?
No, I think it's left up to the shelter's discretion of who they would identify. The same thing goes along with TVPRA services, is who they consider under the rules of have they been a victim of abuse or trafficking or disability. That's who they identify to have that PVRS or that home study.
Generally, they've identified a risk, which is why at this point, the case manager would go in just to figure out, is this in fact a risk? Are there other things? And there have been circumstances where a case could be referred for a couple of things. And then Israeli goes in and she's like, oh my God, there's like 10 other things as to why this minor should not be placed in this home.
Right.
Or it could be one of those situations where it in fact is a risk, but it's something that we could work through and that sponsor could address and then get that minor released to them.
Yeah, it just seems like if you were able to do a home study prior to any child being released, just like you would in a foster care system or adoption, that would obviously be incredibly beneficial, and you might be able to suss out any potential issues once they're released.
Right.
So I was just curious. So we said that we work with about 60 to 65 children a year right now. Is that correct?
It generally, last year was about 60 to 65. For this year, we're expected, it went up a little bit to about 75 cases. Again, that may vary depending on how things may change. As we saw last year with COVID, things changed drastically, but generally it's around that number. For this year, we're expecting about 75.
Okay, perfect. And I know we're getting to the end of our time, so just a few more questions. Israeli, what has it been like working with the children during COVID, right? I would imagine, again, if you're talking about home studies, it's much more difficult to do a home study over Zoom than it is to actually go in and see a home. But what has that been like? And then how has COVID impacted the children that are being placed in Connecticut?
So for now, we've been communicating through phone, through video chats. I've been checking in with the children because due to COVID, there's already that language barrier between school. So now adding on the computer aspect to it, a lot of them have not had computers, do not know how to navigate. So it can be
just the technology.
Right. It can become a little frustrating, especially not having that language to be able to communicate their frustrations. So I've been checking in with them, seeing how we can work not only with the school, but also with the sponsor as well. So it's been a challenge, but we're getting there. And also with a lot of our concerns with COVID, a lot of the sponsors lost employment, and it's put a huge financial strain on the families that we've been working with. A lot of them are not eligible for any type of relief or any type of assistance, unfortunately. So it's been ensuring you guys have enough to eat, you have enough for 2 weeks. We've been fortunate enough to be able to provide food donations to them, and I deliver it to them as well. But it has been its challenges.
Tremendously difficult. And I have to just, give a public shout out to Grace Farms Foundation in New Canaan, who has been a tremendous partner really since March of last year, maybe April, but for a good 11 months, they have provided us with weekly or biweekly food donations. And then we are able to donate and deliver that food to clients that you all work with, to refugee clients. That has just gone such a long way, because we know that food insecurity is one of the biggest struggles out of COVID.
Right.
I have 2 quick questions in the chat, and then we'll round out with kind of what's the look ahead. So Jay asked, there was legislation proposed by Rep. Gilchrist this session regarding human trafficking, the vacatur law, I believe. He says, unfortunately, it's my understanding that it's not moving forward. Do you have any updates there, Leonella? And he's curious what impact that may have had on our services, if any.
I don't really have any updates on that as of now. It's something that we'll keep a lookout on. We work closely with Jillian and other providers throughout the state because we are an anti-human trafficking program. And that, as we mentioned, it works very closely with the Unaccompanied Minors program. So it's something that we're constantly on the lookout for, specifically when we're talking about these labor trafficking cases and that labor trafficking concern that we're seeing with the unaccompanied children.
Okay, great. We will follow up
Yes.
with that, Jay, and then I will get back to you. And then Laura says, how is it that these children end up in foster care? To me, that means they weren't able to identify a sponsor, but were relocated to Connecticut anyways. Or does the sponsor fall through for a variety of reasons?
It could look a number of ways. So we've had cases where they're not able to identify the sponsor, or they have identified a sponsor that is just not able to care for them. So those children, they'll continue working to try to identify somebody to take them in. If it comes to the point where they have not identified anyone, they could go into the foster care system. There have also been instances where the minor is already living with the sponsor, but then that sponsor just doesn't want to take care of the minor or is not able to care for the minor. And that's when we work closely with the Department of Children and Families to identify somebody that is able to take on that minor and provide the services and assist that minor at least until they're of age. So we've seen both cases, both type of cases. I would say both very difficult, obviously, because our hope is to be able to work, and I think the Office of Refugee Resettlement, everyone, we hope to be able to reunite these children with somebody that they do know. But if there is enough of a risk, that's something that will not be done, because obviously our biggest concern is that we want these children to be safe, to be in a place where they'll be able to access the resources that Israeli mentioned earlier, and, attend the immigration court and do everything that they're expected to do. So we've seen both, and I would say both very difficult.
Okay. And we touched today mostly on the social services we provide, but obviously we have a huge part of our work is immigration legal services. So to the extent possible, all of our areas of work overlap so that we are able to provide social and legal support. We'll do another segment that really focuses on the legal piece of our work and unaccompanied minors, but I want to round out because I know we went a little bit longer than we said we would, but this has been a great conversation. So really looking ahead, during the previous administration, multiple policies were put into place that impacted unaccompanied minors, right? We saw zero tolerance policies, which resulted in separation of parents and children and the designation of well over 4,000 children as unaccompanied children. We've seen information sharing policies put out. So, ORR, ICE, Customs Border Protection now sharing information, and sponsors being scared to, come take a child because of fear that information is going to be shared. Many of these concerns are being alleviated under the current administration, and that piece is hopeful. But what do you think we're going to see looking ahead? We're going to see an increase in unaccompanied minors coming into the United States and then Connecticut? Is everything going to get better? What's it going to look like over the next, I would say, year to 2 years?
I think just based on numbers that we're looking at as a program, I think there will be an increase. In terms of how big that increase will be, I'm not sure. But I do think in terms of providers and we're just working to make things better and to get these children with the sponsors that they are hoping to reunite with. I know I was reading an article, and they are hoping to get these children reunified within, I think right now we're looking at about 42 days. Obviously that varies depending on the type of case that we're looking at. But, I would say in terms of me personally, I'm hopeful that we're looking at a future where children will be given, better access to resources, and that we're very mindful of the, of the things that they are encountering as they're crossing the border, why they're leaving their home countries,
Right.
and then risks that they also run while they're here, their vulnerability. So, for me, I would say, hopeful that things will get better for them. And if we are providing services to more children, right, then that's a sign that we are helping more people in the community, which is why we have
Absolutely.
these programs. So.
Absolutely. Israeli, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, it's the same. Just hopeful that, with this administration, it'll be more beneficial for the children, especially getting the resources that they need. Any potential, if there is any change in the law, anything that they can maybe qualify to receive status. But we are hopeful and hoping that, things get a little better.
Yeah, wonderful. I always like to wrap these up with the final question of, what can people do? What should they be aware of? Leonel, I know we've spoken a lot about just awareness, right? Awareness that human trafficking occurs in Connecticut, awareness of the fact that unaccompanied youth are living in Connecticut. And again, some may be in great situations and some may not be. In 30 seconds or less, we'll go Israeli and then Leonella. What is it you hope people really take away from this conversation? And, what would you tell somebody who wants to do something about this issue? How can they help?
Sure. So a takeaway would be especially getting to know what is an unaccompanied minor and the risks that they run living here, and what other things it's difficult for them. Having a child who's unaccompanied compared to a child who was born here, they face completely different things as well. That maybe. So that's some of the things. And as far as if anyone's willing to help, educating other people, being engaged in those, like their representatives, about how they can change the policies around unaccompanied minors.
Terrific.
Major takeaway.
Terrific. Leonella?
Yeah, I think actually you said it, these conversations that we're having. Very recently, we were in one of the school systems, we were given the opportunity to talk to the teachers and the people that work at the schools. Yes. And I found that to be so helpful. And I think that teachers did as well, because it was a platform where we could talk about these vulnerabilities that these children have and how we can better help these children since they are in our community. So I think definitely having these conversations. And if there are people that are interested in having these different conversations, to let us know, because we're very willing to go out and talk about this and help, at least try to provide some answers. And then in terms of what people can do, Israeli said, educating, advocating for these children. And then obviously, if there are any resources that you would like to share with the children, getting in touch with us and letting us know. One of various groups, what they tend to do is often donate backpacks for our children, and that's very helpful. We get children year round that need to go to school, need to go to summer camps. So having those backpacks has been very helpful. Obviously, during COVID, also people have been sharing resources in order to help provide for these families. So, I think it begins with a conversation and identifying the needs that we're seeing with those particular families at the moment, and then we take it from there. So yeah, that's my bit.
Exactly. Wonderful. And I agree, go to our website. My email is on there. Leonella's email is on there. Israeli's email is there. There's always ways to get involved with our work. We're happy to come do these presentations at your business or, any organizations. And, there's opportunities for volunteering with Syria as well. So with that, we will wrap up. Thank you both for joining me today for this conversation. This will be online on Facebook. Again, it'll be on our YouTube page and our website within the next 2 days. And we will be setting up another conversation for the end of the month. So thank you to everybody for joining. And thank you, Leonel and Israeli, for your time.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.